I bought the piece of land that no one wanted, so I could keep one last promise to my late wife. Then the HOA president marched in with bulldozers, smiled, and started building her private resort right on top of it. She thought she had all the power, backed by her lawyers and her fake rules. But she didn't know her entire corrupt empire was built on one tiny mistake in the county records. A mistake I was about to use to tear it all down. Where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments, because this takedown is absolutely epic. And if you believe homeowners should never be bullied by power-hungry HOAs, hit that subscribe button, because you're about to see what happens when they mess with the wrong veteran. The morning fog was still settled on the water when I walked the property line, hammer in my left hand, a roll of sketches in my right. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine, the way Sarah had always liked it. Her old canvas fishing chair sat by the water's edge, right where I'd left it. It was faded and worn, but it held the spot. Our spot. I unrolled the plans on a flat rock, weighting the corners down. It wasn't much, just a simple T-dock, 16 feet long, 4 feet wide. Big enough for her chair, my stool, and a small cooler. Enough to watch the sunrise. I'd made her a promise, and I intended to keep it. When I bought the land 6 months prior, the real estate agent tried to talk me out of it. "Jack, it's just a 2-acre scrap," he'd said, pointing at the map. "It's marshy, a pain to access, and technically it sits behind the Oak Haven HOA's community trail. No one's wanted it for 20 years. That was the whole point. No one wanted it. It was forgotten, quiet, and mine. I'd paid cash, and the deed felt heavier than any metal I'd ever been given. It felt like peace. The peace lasted exactly 3 weeks. The first sign of trouble came in a bright blue polo shirt. A woman with a clipboard and a haircut sharp enough to cut glass marched down the trail, stopping right at the edge of my property. She squinted at the wooden stakes I'd hammered into the ground to mark the dock's footprint. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice slicing through the quiet morning. "This area is for Oak Haven residents only." I walked over, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Morning, I am a resident, Jack Turner. I own this parcel." She gave a short, dry laugh, like I'd just told a terrible joke. "That's not possible, sir. This land is designated as a protected community buffer zone." I held my ground, kept my voice even. I learned long ago, you don't win arguments by raising your voice. You win them with facts. I have the deed and the county survey filed downtown. It's private property. She just shook her head, made a note on her clipboard, and marched away without another word. I thought that was the end of it. It was just the beginning. 2 days later, a white envelope was taped to my front door. Inside was a letterhead from the Oak Haven Homeowners Association and a bill for $500. The violation was listed in cold black print: unauthorized construction and land alteration. I drove down to the community clubhouse, a sterile building that smelled like cheap air freshener and resentment. The woman behind the desk directed me to the president's office. Pamela Griggs sat behind a large mahogany desk that was far too big for the small room. She had the same sharp, dismissive look as the woman with the clipboard. I placed the letter on her desk. "There's been a mistake," I said. "I received a fine for construction on my own land." She glanced at it, then pushed it back toward me with one perfectly manicured finger. "There's no mistake, Mr. Turner," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Your property may be private, but any activity on it that impacts the community aesthetic or environment falls under HOA oversight. It's in the covenants." I knew for a fact it wasn't, because I'd read them cover to cover before I bought the place. My land isn't part of the HOA. It was never incorporated into the development. She leaned back, the smile tightening. "It's not personal, sir. It's community policy. We have to protect property values for everyone." It was a masterclass in saying nothing. She talked in circles, wrapping her illegal threats in polite, corporate nonsense, until it was clear she had no intention of listening to reason. She was a brick wall, and she enjoyed being one. I left her office feeling a cold knot in my stomach. I drove back to the lake, back to my patch of quiet earth. I sat in Sarah's old chair and looked out at the water, at the spot where our dock was supposed to be. Before she passed, when she was too weak to go out anymore, she'd made me promise her. "Find us a spot, Jack," she'd whispered, her hand in mine. "A place by the water. Build me a dock and watch one more sunrise for me." This wasn't just about a piece of land. This wasn't about a $500 fine. This was about that promise. It was the last one I could ever keep for her. I felt the anger then, a slow burn that started deep in my chest. This woman, this Pamela Griggs, was trying to steal a ghost. The next morning, a low rumble woke me before dawn. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of diesel engines. I threw on my boots and rushed out the door, running toward the lake. My heart hammered against my ribs. Through the trees, I could see it. Two yellow bulldozers, their lights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, were pushing mounds of my soil, ripping out the young pines I'd been so careful to leave standing. They weren't just near my property line. They were on it. And standing on the HOA trail, holding a thermos and watching the destruction like it was a morning parade, was Pamela Griggs. She saw me. She raised her thermos in a mock toast and gave a little wave. A triumphant, satisfied smile plastered across her face. She was waving like she'd just conquered a foreign country. My country. I ran, the cold air burning my lungs. I didn't even stop to close my front door. The roar of the engines grew louder, a mechanical grinding that felt like it was chewing up the world. When I broke through the tree line, the scene was worse than I had imagined. Two men in dirty jeans and hard hats operated the bulldozers, moving with a casual efficiency that made my blood run cold. They weren't just clearing a path. They were systematically erasing every feature of the land I had so carefully chosen. The small grove of birch trees Sarah would have loved. Gone. The cluster of ferns near the water's edge, buried under a pile of mud and rock. I had the deed folded in my back pocket, a crisp square of paper that suddenly felt as flimsy as a napkin. I pulled it out and waved it, yelling over the engine noise. "Stop! You're on private property! This land is mine!" The bigger of the two operators killed his engine and hopped down from the cab. He was a thick-set man with a permanent scowl. He wiped grease from his hands with a rag and looked me up and down. "Boss told us to clear this section. Got a work order from the Oakhaven HOA. I shoved the deed toward him. "Look at it. This is a county-filed deed. You're trespassing." He glanced at the paper without reading it, then let out a short, humorless laugh. "Buddy, all I know is the lady paying me said this whole area is under HOA jurisdiction. You got a problem, you take it up with her." He climbed back into his machine and fired it up, drowning out anything else I had to say. They were just following orders. It was Pamela Griggs who had given them. Defeated, I walked back to my house, the sound of my land being torn apart following me every step of the way. I went straight to the phone and called the county records office. My hands were shaking, and I had to dial the number twice. A polite, tired-sounding woman answered. I explained the situation as calmly as I could, giving her my parcel number and name. There was a long silence on the other end, just the sound of keyboard clicks. "Well, Mr. Turner, you're right," she said finally. "That parcel is privately owned by you. It's not legally part of the Oakhaven development." A wave of relief washed over me. It was so simple, a mistake. "But," she continued, and the relief vanished, "I am seeing a pending file here. Looks like the Oakhaven HOA submitted an easement request for that parcel just last week. It's for community access and environmental maintenance." Last week. This wasn't a mistake. It was a planned attack. She hadn't just sent the bulldozers. She had laid the groundwork, building a paper trail to cover her tracks. I hung up the phone and sank into a chair, my head in my hands. That's when I heard a knock on my door. It was my neighbor from 2 streets over, Miguel Ortiz. He was an electrician, a Marine vet like me, though from a different era. He held a tablet in his hand. "Saw the circus down at the lake," he said, his expression grim. "That woman Griggs, she's a piece of work. Figured you might need this." He handed me the tablet. On the screen was a high-resolution aerial photograph from a mapping service, date stamped 3 months ago. My 2 acres were clearly visible, lush and green. He swiped the screen, and a new photo appeared, this one taken that morning by a drone he owned. The image showed the 2 bulldozers, bright yellow scars on the land, their tracks digging deep into my property, well past any conceivable boundary line. "She's not just on your property, Jack," Miguel said quietly. "She's halfway to the water. That ain't an easement, that's an invasion." He was the first person who hadn't looked at me like I was crazy. He saw it too. The flicker of hope I felt was small, but it was there. With these photos, with my deed, No board could deny the facts. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I printed the aerial photos, made certified copies of my deed and the property survey, and wrote down a calm, point-by-point summary of the events. I was going to be reasonable. I was going to be professional. I would present the facts, and the board would have to see the truth. The night of the board meeting, the community room was half full. Pamela Griggs sat at the head of the table, flanked by a nervous-looking secretary and 2 men who stared straight ahead, their faces blank. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium and laid out my evidence. I presented the deed. I showed them the survey map. I passed around Miguel's photos, showing the clear boundary markers and the bulldozers sitting 20 yards inside them. I spoke evenly, without raising my voice. As you can see, I concluded, the HOA's contractors have caused significant damage to my private property. All I'm asking is for the work to stop, and for the HOA to cover the cost of restoring the land. For a moment, there was a murmur in the audience. A few people were nodding. I thought I'd gotten through. Then Pamela Griggs picked up her gavel. She didn't look at my evidence. She didn't address a single point I'd made. She looked right at me, her face a mask of polite authority, and brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that silenced the room. "Thank you for your input, Mr. Turner," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The board appreciates your passion. However, for the benefit and safety of the entire community, we have already voted to approve the Lakeside Resort Deck Initiative. Construction has begun, and it will continue as scheduled. Motion carried." She pounded the gavel again. Just like that, it was over. My proof meant nothing. The law meant nothing. All that mattered was her power. I walked out of that sterile room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The rage inside me was a white-hot, silent thing. I couldn't breathe. I felt completely, utterly helpless. I stood under a flickering streetlight in the empty parking lot, looking in the direction of the lake, at the patch of darkness where my trees used to be, the place where Sarah's dock was supposed to be. They hadn't just bulldozed some land, they had bulldozed a memory. They had bulldozed a promise. A cold clarity settled over me, pushing the helpless rage aside and leaving something harder in its place. Something forged in places far worse than a suburban community room. Pamela Griggs thought she had won. She thought her little gavel and her fake rules made her a queen. She had no idea what a real fight looked like. I looked at the dark sky and whispered the words into the night. A new promise taking root. "You took her dock. Now I take your kingdom." The anger from the board meeting burned itself out by morning, leaving behind something cold and quiet. Grief makes you soft, makes you want to reason with people who have no reason. This was different. This was work. I spent 30 years as a combat engineer, and I knew one thing better than anything else. You don't defeat an enemy by charging at their strongest point. You find the cracks in their foundation. You study their supply lines. You learn their structure until you know it better than they do. So I went back to the HOA office, not to argue, but to request records. Every resident has the right to view the association's documents. The secretary, a nervous woman named Linda Crow, seemed surprised to see me. She probably expected me to be shouting or making threats. Instead, I was polite. I requested copies of the last 5 years of board meeting minutes, the complete annual budgets, and a list of all approved vendors. She couldn't legally refuse. An hour later, I walked out with a banker's box full of paper. My new mission had begun. I spread the documents across my kitchen table like a set of battle plans. For 2 solid days, I did nothing but read. I read through endless pages of arguments about lawn ornaments and the approved shade of beige for mailboxes. But underneath all that petty nonsense, I started to see patterns, sloppy filings, invoices from companies that didn't seem to have a phone number, let alone a physical address, line items in the budget for environmental consulting that cost tens of thousands of dollars but had no corresponding reports. It was a kingdom built on amateur paperwork and bluff. Then I found the name Keller Construction. They were the ones who had bulldozed my land. According to the invoices, they were also responsible for landscaping, trail maintenance, and clubhouse repairs. They were getting paid a lot of money, and the invoices were all signed off by Pamela Griggs herself. I called Miguel. "You still got that drone?" I asked. "And are you any good at digging around on the internet?" He was at my house within the hour, a laptop under his arm. "What are we looking for, brother?" he asked, sitting down at the table. I pointed to the name. "Keller Construction. See what you can find." Miguel's fingers flew across the keyboard. He was a wizard with this stuff. 10 minutes later, he stopped and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he said, turning the screen toward me. Keller Construction was registered 3 years ago. Sole proprietor, Todd Keller. He clicked another link and a social media profile popped up. It was a photo of Todd Keller at a family barbecue, his arms slung around a smiling Pamela Griggs. The caption read, "Hanging with my favorite sister-in-law." Her brother-in-law. She wasn't just building a resort deck. She was funneling community money directly into her own family's pockets. This was big, but it wasn't the kill shot. Proving fraud would take lawyers and time, and she'd bury me in legal fees. I needed something more direct, something undeniable. So, the next morning, I drove back to the county land office. Not the records clerk this time, but the survey and deeds department in the basement, the place that smelled like old paper and patience. I pulled the original plat map for the Oak Haven development, a huge crackling document from the early 90s. And there it was, in faded blue ink. The developers had drawn their boundary line, and my 2-acre parcel was clearly, definitively outside of it. The HOA's own founding deed, the very document that gave them their authority, did not include my land. They had no more legal right to it than they did to the moon. And their brand new half-built resort deck, I could see from the construction markers, extended a good 15 feet over my property line. They weren't just trespassing with bulldozers, they were building a permanent structure on land they didn't own. Armed with this knowledge, I started my campaign. It wasn't loud, it was quiet, precise. I went to the hardware store and bought 3 professionally printed aluminum signs. No trespassing. Private property. Violators will be prosecuted. I mounted them on steel posts and cemented them into the ground along my property line, right in front of their construction site. They were gone the next day, ripped out of the ground. I put up another set. They disappeared overnight. So I started mailing certified letters to the HOA board, one every single day. Each letter calmly stated the facts, my ownership, their trespassing, and a formal request to cease and desist all construction. I knew they'd ignore them, but that wasn't the point. The point was the green return receipt cards that came back to my mailbox, each one signed by Pamela's nervous secretary, Linda. I was building my own paper trail, a stack of legal proof that they had been warned. Word started to get around. People saw the signs go up and get torn down. Miguel told me a few neighbors had brought it up at the coffee shop. A couple of the older guys, a retired plumber and another Army vet, started giving me a quiet nod when I drove by. They were tired of Pamela's iron-fisted rule, the endless fines for trash cans left out an hour too long, or grass that was a quarter-inch too high. They saw a fight they'd been wanting to have for years, and now they had a horse in the race. But Pamela's machine was still in full motion. I was a nuisance, not a threat. She thought she had already won. She didn't see me that night, long after the construction crews had gone home. I was out on the torn-up land with my old Army-issue Transit and tripod. Under the cold moonlight, I began to take measurements. I drove stakes into the ground, marking exact coordinates with grim precision. Sarah had wanted a dock, a place of peace. But what I was mapping now wasn't a place for sunrises. They think I'm beaten, I thought as I adjusted the lens, focusing on the dark silhouette of their half-finished deck. I'm just measuring the battlefield. With my measurements complete, I took the next logical step. I hired a local lawyer, a young guy hungry enough to take on an HOA, and had him draft a formal cease and desist letter. It was ironclad, citing the county plat map, the legal definition of trespass, and my stack of signed certified mail receipts. We sent it directly to Pamela Griggs. I expected a counteroffer, a negotiation, maybe even a tense phone call. What I got was a glossy newsletter in my mailbox a week later. On the front page was a photo of Pamela, shovel in hand, at a fake groundbreaking ceremony. The headline read, "Oak Haven Lakeside Resort and Community Deck Breaks Ground." Below it, a glowing article she'd written herself detailed the long-awaited community enhancement, complete with artists' renderings of happy families enjoying the view from a deck that was half on my land. She wasn't just ignoring my legal warning, she was flaunting it. She was laughing at me in print. That's when things got ugly. The next morning, I tried to walk down to my property to check on the construction, and a rent-a-cop in a cheap security uniform blocked my path. He was an older guy with a gut hanging over his belt, but he held himself like he was guarding Fort Knox. "Sorry, sir," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "This is a restricted construction area, Oak Haven residents only." I looked him in the eye. "I own that land. I am an Oak Haven resident. Step aside." He put a hand on his hip near a holstered radio. "My orders are from the board. No one past this point." Pamela had hired guards to keep me off my own property. The retaliation didn't stop with me. A few days later, Miguel called. His voice was tight with anger. He'd just lost a major contract to rewire the clubhouse lighting, a job he'd been promised for months. "Pamela called the contractor herself," he said. "Told him I was a disruptive element in the community and that the board wouldn't approve any work done by my company. He had 3 kids to feed. He'd put his neck out for me, and she had chopped it off without a second thought, just to send a message. That was the moment my confidence cracked. I was standing in my kitchen, staring out the window at the stupid newsletter taped to my fridge, and the fight just went out of me. What was I doing? I was a retired engineer, not a lawyer or a politician. I was picking a fight with a machine that had unlimited funds, the residents' funds, and no morals. She was hurting people. Good people like Miguel. Maybe the real estate agent was right. Maybe it was just a worthless piece of land. I could sell it, take the loss, and walk away. Buy a different plot of land somewhere else. But the thought felt like a betrayal. That afternoon, I found myself driving to the cemetery. I hadn't been there in months. I just needed to be somewhere quiet. I stood in front of Sarah's headstone, the granite cool under my fingertips. The grass was neatly trimmed, and someone had left a small bouquet of daisies. I just stood there, the silence of the place pressing in on me. "I'm failing you, Sar," I whispered, the words getting caught in my throat. "I made you a promise, and I can't keep it. This woman, she's too much. I think I have to give up." I traced the letters of her name, feeling the weight of my own helplessness. I was letting some clipboard tyrant desecrate the one thing I had left of her. Then, my fingers stopped on the last line of her epitaph, a quote she loved. "The world is supported by the atlas-like pillars of men's pride." She never meant it as a good thing. She meant it was a weakness, a predictable flaw. And as I stood there, looking at that stone, my mind drifted away from the HOA, from the land, back to my time overseas. I remembered a mission in a mountain pass. We had to stop an enemy supply convoy, but we couldn't just blow up the bridge. We needed it intact for our own advance later. So, we didn't destroy it. We redirected it. We spent 2 nights in the freezing cold, building a temporary causeway, a simple but brilliant structure that shifted the entire flow of traffic with the removal of a single, critical pivot pin. At the decisive moment, we pulled the pin, and the bridge shifted, leading the convoy right into a box canyon. We didn't fight their strength. We used their own momentum against them. A thought sparked in my mind, so clear and sharp it felt like a jolt of electricity. Ownership, property, deeds. I had been thinking about it all wrong. I was trying to fight Pamela's power with my own claim. But what if I didn't have to? What if I could just take hers? Her power wasn't personal. It came from the HOA. The HOA was just a corporation, a legal entity made of bylaws and votes. I had been fighting the HOA, but the HOA was also a fortress with a critical flaw. It was built on the shaky pillars of its members' debts and obligations. Standing there in the quiet cemetery, a plan began to form, a crazy, audacious idea that felt both impossible and perfectly logical. I pulled out my phone, my hands steady now. I called the county clerk's office again, but this time I asked for the Department of Tax Liens and Public Records. When the clerk answered, I asked one quiet, simple question. "I have a question about homeowners association regulations," I said. "Can a single homeowner or a company legally buy out a majority stake in an HOA if enough unpaid fines and public tax liens stack high enough?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear papers shuffling. Then the clerk's voice came back, cautious and precise. "Well, that's highly unusual, sir, but technically, yes. A lien is a debt, and a controlling interest is just a numbers game. Technically, yes, it's possible." A slow smile spread across my face. Pamela Griggs thought she was playing checkers. She had no idea I was about to flip the whole board. The next phase of the operation was silent. It was all about patience and precision, fought not with bulldozers, but with bank drafts and county filing stamps. While Pamela Griggs was busy supervising the construction of her monument to herself, I was in the dusty basement of the county courthouse, combing through public records. Every HOA fine that goes unpaid for more than 90 days becomes a public lien against the property. It's a small debt, usually just a few $100s, but it's a legal foothold, and Pamela, in her quest for absolute control, had slapped liens on dozens of properties over the years for the pettiest infractions: unapproved garden gnomes, faded window shutters, cars parked on the street for 2 hours instead of 1. To her, they were tools of intimidation. To me, they were opportunities. Most homeowners eventually paid them off to avoid the hassle, but some didn't. Some moved away. Some were elderly and couldn't afford the fight. These small, forgotten debts were sitting on the public record, available for anyone to purchase for pennies on the dollar. So, that's what I did. I started buying them, quietly, one by one. I used a portion of my retirement savings, money Sarah and I had put away for a rainy day. This felt like a monsoon. I drove to the county tax auction every Tuesday morning, a thermos of coffee in hand, and sat in the back. I bought up small, unpaid county tax claims against common areas owned by the Oak Haven HOA, little slivers of debt for forgotten parcels of land that they hadn't bothered to pay taxes on for years. They were so busy policing their residents, they had neglected their own house. Each purchase was a small brick in my new foundation. I never did it in my own name. Miguel helped me set up a new limited liability company, a shell corporation with a bland, forgettable name, Clearwater Holdings, LLC. He was the only one who knew what I was doing. He'd come over in the evenings and we'd sit at my kitchen table, tracking the ownership percentages on a spreadsheet. "You're at 15%. Jack," he'd say, a grin spreading across his face. A week later, 22%. Every deed transfer, every lien purchase was recorded with military precision. I filed each piece of paper myself, making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. Pamela's power was built on sloppy paperwork. Mine would be built on granite. All the while, the resort deck on my land grew larger. The sounds of saws and hammers became the soundtrack to my mornings. I ignored them. I let her think she was winning. I let her get comfortable. The more she built, the better my plan would work. The pinnacle of her triumph was the resort grand opening event she planned for the first Saturday in October. It was an all-out affair. She had flyers printed, invited the local news, and promised a ribbon-cutting ceremony with free barbecue for all Oak Haven residents. It was her victory party, a celebration of her absolute dominion over the community. And I was going to be there. I showed up right on time, wearing a simple collared shirt and clean jeans. I didn't bring signs or shout. I just stood at the back of the small crowd, watching. The deck was finished, a sprawling wooden structure with built-in benches and fancy solar-powered lights. It was, I had to admit, well built, but a good 20% of it sat squarely on my land. Pamela Griggs was in her element. She stood at a podium wearing a crisp white pantsuit, smiling for the local news camera. She gave a speech full of words like community, progress, and shared vision. She talked about how this deck would increase property values for everyone. Then she picked up a giant pair of ceremonial scissors to cut the big red ribbon stretched across the entrance. Just as she was about to snip it, she spotted me in the crowd. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by that familiar, smug smirk. She wanted to make an example of me one last time. She put down the scissors and pointed a finger right at me, her voice ringing out for everyone to hear. "Hold on, everyone. It seems we have an uninvited guest. Mr. Turner, I've warned you before. You are trespassing on HOA property. Again." The crowd turned to look at me. The news camera swiveled in my direction. This was the moment she had been waiting for. But it was the moment I had been waiting for, too. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, a calm, easy smile, and started walking toward her. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I walked right up to the podium, past the stunned rent-a-cop, and handed it to her. She looked at the envelope, confused. "What is this?" she asked, her voice losing some of its confidence. "Open it," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. Her hands trembled slightly as she tore open the flap. She pulled out the first page. It was a legal notice. She read the first line, and the color drained from her face. Her perfect smile dissolved into a mask of pure, slack-jawed shock. The guests started murmuring, sensing that something had gone terribly wrong with the carefully scripted ceremony. The document she held was a formal declaration from Clearwater Holdings, LLC. It detailed the purchase of 72 individual property liens and 4 outstanding tax claims, which, when combined, constituted a 54% controlling interest in the Oak Haven Homeowners Association. It also included a copy of the county survey map, with the section of her precious new deck sitting on my land highlighted in bright red. I leaned closer to the microphone she had been using. "Effective immediately," I said, my voice calm and clear for everyone, including the news camera, to hear. "You and your contractors are standing on my property." I paused, letting the words sink in. Again. The grand opening ended abruptly. Pamela Griggs stared at the papers in her hand as if they were written in a foreign language, her mouth opening and closing, with no sound coming out. The local news cameraman, sensing a much better story than a boring ribbon cutting, zoomed in on her face. The crowd erupted in confused chatter, passing the news of my legal maneuver through the rows like a secret. Within minutes, the barbecue was forgotten and the deck was empty, leaving just me, a speechless Pamela, and her nervous board members. She didn't recover quickly. It took her 3 days to call an emergency HOA meeting, 3 days in which the story of the disastrous opening ceremony spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. She billed the meeting as an opportunity to clarify misinformation and address the baseless claims of a disgruntled resident. She even set up a phone on a tripod to live stream the meeting to the community's social media page, a desperate attempt to control the narrative. That was her second mistake. Her first was underestimating me. This one was putting her own downfall on camera for the world to see. The community room was packed. This time, no one was on their phone. Every eye was on the front of the room. Pamela started the meeting, her voice tight and strained, trying to project the same old authority. She launched into a rambling speech about fiduciary duty and community standards, painting me as a hostile outsider trying to disrupt the neighborhood through fraudulent means. This Clearwater Holdings, she spat the name out, is a shadowy entity attempting a hostile takeover based on clerical errors and manipulated paperwork. It is illegal, it is unethical, and we will be fighting it with the full force of our legal team. She was trying to bully her way through it, just like she always did, but this time, the facts were not on her side. When she finished, I raised my hand. "I believe, as the majority stakeholder, I have the right to address the board," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room. She had no choice but to let me speak. She gestured angrily toward the podium. I walked to the front, not with a single envelope, but with a thick binder. I opened it and placed it on the podium, my preparations complete. "There's no fraud, Pamela," I began, speaking not to her, but to the residents, to the camera, to my neighbors. "There's just math and public records. For years, this board has used fines and liens as weapons against its own residents. I just used them as they were intended, as a financial instrument." I then calmly, methodically laid out the truth. I started with the land. I put the official county plat map on the document projector, the huge image of Oak Haven's boundaries filling the screen behind me. My parcel was a clear island, untouched by their development. "The HOA has never owned my land," I said, "yet they bulldozed it and built this deck on it. That's not a clerical error, that's trespass." Then I moved on to the money. "This board has spoken a lot about property values. Let's talk about how they've been spending your money." I projected a copy of an invoice from Keller Construction, her brother-in-law's company. The charge was for $20,000 for trail mulching. Then I projected an aerial photo from that same week, showing the trails bare and unmulched. "This is one of dozens of fake invoices," I explained. "Money paid for work that was never done, funneled from your dues into the pocket of the president's family." A wave of angry murmurs swept through the room. People were turning to look at Pamela, their expressions shifting from confusion to outrage. I saw Miguel in the crowd, giving me a slow, steady nod. Someone shouted, "Is that true, Pamela?" She sat frozen, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her right-hand woman, Linda, Looked like she was about to be physically ill. The meltdown began. Pamela shot to her feet, pointing at me. Lies! These are all lies! He's doctoring these documents. He's trying to ruin this community. But the dam had broken. The fear she had cultivated for years was gone, replaced by a sense of betrayal. Homeowners started shouting questions, demanding answers about their money, about the special assessments, about the endless fines. One resident, a woman I'd never met, stood up and filmed Pamela's sputtering defense on her phone. Just then, the double doors at the back of the room swung open. 2 uniformed county sheriff's deputies walked in. They weren't rent-a-cops. They were the real deal. They walked calmly to the front of the room. One of them approached Pamela's brother-in-law, Todd Keller, who had been trying to shrink into his chair. "Mr. Keller, you need to come with us." Todd's face went white. The deputy cuffed him right there in front of everyone. The second deputy handed Pamela a citation. "Ma'am, you've been formally cited for criminal trespass and harassment based on Mr. Turner's complaint." The room erupted. Pamela stared at the paper, then at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Her entire kingdom, her perfect, orderly world, had crumbled around her in less than 10 minutes, broadcast live for all her subjects to see. I stepped back up to the microphone, the room slowly falling silent as the deputies led a protesting Todd Keller out the door. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors. They weren't just angry anymore. They looked relieved. "This was never just about a piece of land," I said, my voice steady. "It was about respect. This is a community of neighbors, not a kingdom for rulers. We all deserve better." A single person started clapping, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. A thunderous wave of applause washing over me. Pamela Griggs was escorted out by the remaining deputy, her head bowed, not in shame, but in utter, absolute defeat. She had taken my wife's dock. I had taken her crown. But standing there, amidst the chaos and the cheers, I knew it wasn't over. Justice had been served, but peace was something you had to build. The weeks that followed were a quiet storm of paperwork. As the majority stakeholder, Clearwater Holdings had the authority to call a vote of no confidence in the existing board. It passed unanimously. Pamela Griggs and her remaining cronies were out. The first order of business for the new, resident-led interim board was to dissolve the Oak Haven HOA as a corporate entity and restructure it as a simple community council. The ridiculous fines were voided. The Book of Covenants, thick as a phone book and twice as annoying, was replaced with a single page of common-sense guidelines, and the monthly dues were cut by 80%, reduced to just enough to cover mowing the common areas and keeping the streetlights on. I didn't want the power. I just wanted to break it. Once the new council was stable, I signed over the controlling interest held by Clearwater Holdings directly to the community, free and clear. My war was over. The land was truly back in the hands of the people who lived on it. Pamela didn't go quietly. A week after being voted out, she tried one last act of sabotage. She made an anonymous call to the County Environmental Protection Office, reporting a dangerous chemical spill on my property, claiming I was dumping hazardous waste into the lake. It was a pathetic, desperate move. An inspector showed up, took one look at the pristine water and the half-finished dock, and knew the call was bogus. But Pamela made a mistake. She couldn't resist watching her final pathetic plan unfold. Another neighbor, the retired plumber who had given me a nod of support, had installed a new security camera on his garage. The footage clearly showed Pamela's car parked down the street, and her sneaking through the woods to watch the inspector's arrival. She was trespassing again. When the sheriff's deputy saw that video, he didn't just write another citation. He arrested her. This time, it was for filing a false report and violating a court-ordered no-contact perimeter. This time, the charges were serious. Her kingdom was finally, completely gone. With the legal noise faded to a whisper, I turned my attention back to my original promise. The first thing I did was hire a crew to dismantle the resort deck. I had them carefully remove the 20% that was on my land, and then, at the new council's request, reconfigure the rest of it on the actual community property, making it a smaller, more sensible public space. My land was clear again. The scars from the bulldozers were still there, but now they looked like the start of something new, not the end of something old. The following Saturday, I woke up before dawn. I loaded my tools, my sketches, and the lumber I'd bought into the back of my truck. When I got down to the lake, I wasn't alone. Miguel was there, coffee and donuts in hand. And so were the plumber and the other Army vet. A few other neighbors showed up behind them, carrying tool belts and wheelbarrows. No one had called them. They just came. "Figured you could use a hand, Jack," Miguel said, clapping me on the shoulder. We spent the entire day working under the warm autumn sun. There was no foreman, no shouting. Just the easy rhythm of hammers, the buzz of a saw, and the quiet satisfaction of skilled hands doing good work. We laughed, we told stories, we built the dock. It was simple, sturdy, and straight as an arrow, exactly like the plans I had drawn so many months ago. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the water, we drove the last nail. A local news van pulled up, the same reporter who had filmed Pamela's meltdown. They had heard about what was happening from Miguel. The short news segment that aired that night wasn't about conflict or legal battles. It was about neighbors helping a neighbor, about a community reclaiming a piece of itself. The final shot was of the finished dock, quiet and peaceful on the edge of the lake. The next morning, I went down to the water alone. I carried Sarah's old canvas fishing chair and set it right at the end of the dock. The fog was rolling in, just like it had on that first morning. I sat down, my coffee in a thermos beside me, and waited. Before I left the house, I'd attached a small brass plaque to the post at the entrance to the dock. It was simple, just a few words. "For Sarah," it read, "sunrise belongs to everyone." They had tried to take this place from me, to build their resort on my promise. They'd used their rules, their lawyers, and their machines. But in the end, all they really built was my resolve. And as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the water in strokes of orange and gold, I knew she could see it. I finally kept my promise.